There is nothing more awesome in all of Warhammer 40K than the walking tanks piloted by mortally wounded soldiers known as dreadnoughts. Possibly the most iconic vehicles in the setting, the zombie mechs, literal walking sarcophagi, are a fan favorite for a reason. But of all the horrific fates in Warhammer 40K lore, becoming a dreadnought is actually one of the worst of all. Having some of the darkest and most torturous lore in the setting, dreadnoughts are absolutely terrifying, despite being one of the most effective and recognizable units in Space Marine armies. So let's dive in deep and look at just why dreadnoughts are so scary in the lore, and so cool to us fans of the setting and players of the game. Because even for many folks who don't know anything about Warhammer 40K, the boxy mechs piloted by undead Space Marines are instantly recognizable as belonging to the setting, to the grim darkness of the far future. But there's a lot more to Warhammer 40K than just Space Marines, and throughout the various editions of the game over the decades, many of the other factions and xenos races have had their own version of the mecha, and some of them are pretty cool. The Ork Deff Dread and Grot's Killicans are lumbering and brutal, more akin to scrap heaps than mechs, and the Aeldari Wraithlords are towering and graceful, hyper-capable warrior mecha powered by the spirits of the dead. But when I think of Warhammer 40K, it is the boxy, lumbering form of the classic dreadnought that pops into my head first. Even before the Adeptus Astartes, or even the very first thing I ever saw for Rogue Trader, the original Land Raider. Its form is just so classic and evokes the setting like nothing else. There's nothing more iconically 40K at all. But the dreadnought that we all think of as the classic box on legs, known as the Castra Ferrus pattern, was not the first iteration of the War Machine. That honor goes to the three OGs from the Rogue Trader era, the Furibundus, the Contemptor, and the Deredeo. Names that have more or less stuck with us to this day, as there are now modern versions of these. But notice how the original dreadnoughts bear little resemblance to what we think of as dreads today. In fact, they're hardly recognizable as dreadnoughts at all, but they do have their own old school sort of charm. You can see why I didn't get into Space Marines until later editions. Early on, when Rogue Trader was a thing, I just couldn't get into their range compared to some of the others. So despite its ugly start, the next iteration of the dreadnought, the Castra Ferrus, came along and changed the game. With an obvious sarcophagus and a darker, smashier tone, this dreadnought pattern would dominate the tabletop in the Warhammer 40K lore for decades. First cast in metal, these boys were extremely chonky. Now, as I said earlier, I didn't get into Space Marines until much later, end of 3rd edition, beginning of 4th or so. So I didn't know just how heavy these things were. But then I had a friend gift me an army as he was moving to Hawaii, and in it was the Blood Angels Furioso Dreadnought. And this thing, I mean, you could literally use it as a doorstop. It felt like the weight of a brick. I'm not exaggerating. But that is when I fell in love with the models, and I got a plastic Castra Ferrus, and have been a fanatic ever since. Eventually, I would add a Venerable Dread to that army, and couldn't have been happier. As I was painting them up, I wanted to understand everything about them, and was blown away by just how dark, depressing, and horrible being interred in a dread really is. Immeasurable suffering for sometimes millennia, psychic pain, a complete loss of the bond between body and mind as the mind loses touch with the limbs it no longer possesses, isolation, sometimes for centuries, and savage anger and rage upon awakening, often to defend an imperium that bears little resemblance to the one you were fighting for the last time you were awakened. Yeah, being a dreadnought sucks, and yet it is seen as a high honor, something reserved for elites such as company captains, chapter masters, and heroes who commit insane deeds and acts of bravery. But this hard wiring into a walking death tank, while it is seen as a huge honor and quite a noble sacrifice, reduces the man that once was to little more than a weapon. Sure, some chapters and warbands rely heavily upon the influence and counsel of their dreadnoughts, whose minds are full of knowledge on how to conduct warfare, some dating back literal millennia. Bjorn the Fell-Handed was alive during the Great Crusade and knew both Layman Russ and the Emperor of Mankind. So he has 10 millennia of knowledge the Space Wolves can draw from, just as an example. But with the Primaris Space Marines now featuring as the primary Space Marines, both in the lore and on the tabletop, we need to talk about the Redemptor. And this thing is awesome. It fixes nearly everything that was a bit silly about the old classic Castra Ferrus, and it doubles down on everything cool about it. I love this model so much, as well as the Ballistus and the Brutalis. They're both excellent as well. But it looks like it means business. It looks like it can walk rather than only waddle like a duck. Part of having actual thighs, I guess. Yeah, it is all around badass looking, and definitely lets you know that it is both a Space Marine vehicle and a giant mechanized robot with just a glance. There's no second guessing what it is, and the weapons on this thing are just over the top. Not as many loadout options as with the Castra Ferrus, but what it does pack with it can deliver quite a punch, especially that plasma incinerator. But the sad dark truths about dreadnoughts stand just as true for the Redemptor as for any other dread, only it gets even worse, as the Redemptor slowly kills its pilot. What it takes to power one of these bad beasts exacts quite a toll on the mortally wounded Space Marine inside, and they don't really last too long. So while it is still an absolute honor as far as Space Marines are concerned, it just makes the inevitable death they are staving off by being interred take a little longer than usual. But there aren't going to be 10,000-year-old Redemptors in the future. Perhaps the body of the mech, but the sarcophagi will contain newer wounded Marines. Truly dark and kind of sad. I feel like any Marine who would get duped into wiring into a dreadnought got the short end of the stick. It is probably a better fate to just die. But despite the horrific toll dreadnoughts take on their pilots, they're still ubiquitous in Warhammer 40K, both in the lore and on the tabletop. I probably wouldn't field a Marine army without at least one, and I know others who feel this way too. The Dreadnought has come to represent the might and fury of the Space Marines. So when the game was still new, in the 90s, there seemed to be this sort of want by the game's designers for every faction to have access to the same sorts of things. So everyone had some sort of bike unit, everyone had a flyer or speeder, everyone had a troop transport, and many armies had their own versions of dreads. And my favorite one of these has got to be the Aeldari Wraithlord. Such an awesome unit. Again, powered by and piloted by the dead. But this time it isn't a mortally wounded guy kept alive by being interred in the dreadnought. With the Aeldari, the Wraithlords are controlled by spirit stones, which house the souls of dead Aeldari to keep them from being devoured by Slaanesh on death. But where the Imperial Space Marine Dreadnoughts are slow, lumbering, heavy machines of war, walking tanks practically, the Wraithlords are swift and fight with the dexterity and agility of an actual Aeldari. They're resilient, though maybe not as much as Imperial Dreadnoughts, but they can put up one hell of a fight. Plus, being Wraithbone constructs, they can be healed by Spirit Seers. And for the Aeldari, the Wraithlords are not just consummate killers, they're absolutely awesome looking. If you're into mecha at all, then this is a unit for you. It has heavy Japanese robot vibes and a sleek, elegant aesthetic, and it absolutely wrecks face on the tabletop. In the lore, it is definitely one strong unit as well. Eldred Ulthrin even brought a Wraithlord to his meeting with Fulgrim, and it took the Primarch to bring it down. So ultimately, even if you aren't a Space Marine fan or player, there's a Dreadnought for you in the setting. Even going all the way back to Rogue Trader, if I'm not mistaken. The Squats had a Dreadnought too. And nothing is more iconically Warhammer 40K than the walking zombie mechs. Dreadnoughts are the Warhammer 40K. So let's look at some of the most awesome Dreadnoughts in the setting and what they did to earn that reputation. So before we got the Castra Ferrus, we had the Contemptor Dreadnought, and the ability to create more of these has been lost to time. That is why we're stuck with the box dread now. But the Custodes do use the Contemptor as well, and if they know how to make more of them, then they aren't sharing it with the Space Marines. But yeah, the Contemptor is from the Great Crusade era, and was the type of dreadnought that you'd usually see during the Horus Heresy and the Scouring. Rylanor, the Ancient of Rights, the loyalist Emperor's children dreadnought who stood against his corrupted brothers at Istvan III. If this isn't your favorite dreadnought, then there's something wrong with you. Rylanor was a Contemptor dreadnought who had fought during the Great Crusade, even before it really kicked off, and had the honor of carrying the Emperor's Palatine Aquila standard into battle. He was mortally wounded by the Aeldari and interred into a dread. The guy was a super Chad, and a real stand-up guy too, but at Istvan III he disappeared, and nobody had seen him since. That's for 10,000 years, until a few thousand suns heard a distress signal and went to investigate. Eventually, they find Rylanor, and his beacon actually summons the being he intended it to, the demon Primarch Fulgrim. Rylanor tells Fulgrim off and explodes a virus bomb after waiting 10,000 years for revenge. But Fulgrim did offer him to become reborn anew, in a body of his own choosing, after peeling the shattered remains of the mortally wounded Marine from the sarcophagus, which he carved open like butter. But Rylanor was like, screw that! He had actual morals and standards and remembered fighting alongside the Emperor of Mankind, and was displeased with how his legion went from that level of loyalty to the depraved hedonists they became. So Rylanor chose to die rather than accept Fulgrim's offer. In my opinion, this is probably the most beloved dreadnought in the setting. He's just such an awesome character, and loyalists from the legions that turn traitor are just cool as hell. Another Contemptor dreadnought worth mentioning is the Anchorite, who is a word-bearer's dread that rejected the teachings of Lorgar and hates chaos and demons. He's awesome. Just such a badass character. But he started out just like everyone else in the word-bearers. But during the fighting on Calth against the Ultramarines, an epiphany hit him. The Ultra's raising of Monarchia had only made the word-bearers stronger. He realized this would be the same for the Ultramarines after Calth, and he saw the never-ending cycle of perpetual war that they were dragging the galaxy into, and he didn't want any part of it. Eventually, he surrendered to Guilliman's forces, and the Primarch had him kept alive as a prisoner. When the Siege of Terra came, he sat in a cell and prayed for his former legion. Eventually, the Anchorite's knowledge would be written down, and that would lead the word-bearers to realize he was still alive, somewhere out there. But not before he strongly, behind the scenes, influenced the creation and beliefs of the Ecclesiarchy and the Imperial Cult, who, despite being based upon his writings, could not divulge the secret that he and his writings were behind them. And as far as I know, the Anchorite is still in the setting, he just hasn't been mentioned in a while. And there are plenty of other Contemptors out there, and for the Horus Heresy range of models, if you're into the tabletop, then it is cool that there are conversion parts that are Legion specific, so you can make your models look extremely customized and scream your Legion and their vibe. I personally really like the Raven Guard one and the Alpha Legion one. But now we're on to the Leviathan Dreadnought, and this is another one of those dreads that, like the Redemptor, that the Primaris use in the current setting, that kills its pilot. It is just a huge strain to pilot a Leviathan. As you can see, it is not just a tank on legs, it is a super heavy siege tank on legs. This thing could probably take a Gloriana class ship smashing right into it and just shrug it off. Heavy duty firepower and unrivaled strength. My favorite Leviathan Dreadnought is Venerable Praefectus Coriolanus of the Dark Angels. He took part in the Thramis Crusade and defended the world of Nadris III from the Night Lords. He sacrificed himself to bring down the roof of the cathedral he was fighting in, and buried himself and his enemies in rubble. Seriously cool looking dreadnought though. And there are a few more cool Leviathans, like the Night Lord's own ancient Reductus Vacurin, who actually was interred in a dread, which was destroyed, and then his brother Astartes jacked the mech from an Ultramarines Leviathan and cut the old sarcophagus out, dumping the mortally wounded Marine inside it out onto the bloody ground and just leaving him there, completely disregarded. They then wired Vacurin into his new metal body, and this time it was Leviathan. Yeah, that's completely awesome. I love the Night Lords. And that brings me to the dark underbelly of this already completely dark subject. Chaos Dreadnoughts. And they have their own long, sordid history. I started playing Chaos Space Marines in 3rd edition, and it was an exciting time. I had seen some other armies get completely redone for 3rd and got almost all new models, so assumed the seriously outdated Chaos Dreadnought would get the same treatment. It did not. I found the 2nd edition Chaos Dread to be extremely, well, derpy, for lack of a better word, so I never got one. But eventually they did redo the Chaos Dread and even gave it its own new name to differentiate it from what it once was. As being a Chaos Dreadnought takes a much worse toll on the pilot. They called them Hellbrutes, and goddamn, they're dark as hell, that's for sure. Absolutely insane, as the process is beyond torture. No Chaos Space Marine wants to be interred and turn into a Hellbrute. It is not the honor it is for the Loyalists, as painful as it is, and as mentally damaging. No, every Hellbrute is absolutely guaranteed to go insane. Usually they're put to sleep and the pilot removed when not in use, if he still can be, as they fuse slowly into something that is biomechanical and cybernetic like an obliterator. But the moment they're plugged back in and turned on, they become raging maniacs. It's like Khorne is shoving a hot poker up every one of their asses, despite their allegiance and what gods their legion follows. Yeah, they're all torqued up on anger and rage and can't really control themselves. Absolute killing machines. They're probably as much of a liability as an asset in many theaters of war. So that is a look at my favorite vehicles in all of Warhammer 40K. Dreadnoughts. And yeah, this one was more of an opinion piece than a lore deep dive, but that's because I have a lot of opinions about this particular unit, and like I said, there's literally nothing else that is as iconically Warhammer 40K than the Dreadnought. Hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks to my channel members for your support. It means the world to me. And if you'd like to join the legends on the screen, then just hit the join button and become a member. And remember, only in death does duty end, until they cram your remains into a sarcophagus and plug you in. Then it's, even in death, I still serve.